introduce myself. I'm Sharon Kennedy. I'm Dean of Career Programs at Moraine Valley, and I'm just here to welcome you to a forum that we hope there will be many more of. This is one of the first forums we're going to have on global education, and it's a very exciting presentation today. I'm not going to be able to stay, but I'm very happy that it is being videotaped and that the career subdivision will be, other students who cannot be here today will be able to see this. Moraine Valley would be remiss if we allowed you to leave this institution without understanding peoples and cultures outside of the United States. As the country and the world becomes increasingly diverse, part of your post-secondary education must be an exposure to other cultures and other ways of functioning in business and in health sciences. I'm very happy that there are a number of health science students here today, and that this particular presentation relates to working in the area of health sciences outside of the United States. Linda, or I should say Catherine Debo, her presentation today on Doctors Without Borders, although I understand there's a French name that I'm sure you'll find out about, is an example of opportunities that are available to you that will expand your horizons beyond Moraine Valley and certainly beyond the Chicago area. And just to bring this down to a kind of a personal level for me, when I was your age, sitting in one of those seats, there were colleges and seats back then. This organization did not exist, at least as far as students in the United States were concerned. The Peace Corps. This was a time when the Peace Corps was very new, and a lot of young people in college were going into the Peace Corps. And so that was the opportunity we had to provide a service to others beyond the United States. So I'm very delighted that you can find out about other ways to provide a service to other human beings outside of the United States. And I truly hope that you will give Catherine your undivided attention today and have lots of questions, and I hope some of you will become a part of the organization, because it is an opportunity available to you through the very capable leadership of Dr. Linda Gruber, and I hope that you find it stimulating and that you reflect on the need to expand your global education. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon and welcome to our first global education event for this semester. You might note my PR for our next talk, which will be on Monday, March 29th, 2 to 3 p.m. in the Moraine rooms. We're going to have the privilege of having a visiting Fulbright professor, someone we're sharing with St. Xavier University, and he's going to talk to us on education in Lebanon. He is a professor at Lebanese University in Beirut. As Sharon mentioned, I'm Linda Gruber, and I am the coordinator of global education for the college. We hear that the world is getting smaller as a result of the use of technology, and yet I like to think that the world is getting smaller because of people who care. And our speaker this afternoon, Catherine Debo, is certainly one of those people. There are other people, though, who care about the world and how we see it and how we view it, starting with our own college, which supports global education events such as these. In particular, I would like to thank Mary Kay Kickles, Dr. Kickles, for her support. She is Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, and Dr. Judy Marwick, Assistant Vice President for Academic Affairs. They've both been very encouraging for this afternoon's event. In career programs, we met Dean Sharon Kennedy, and perhaps you know Assistant Dean Peggy Macon, and Health Sciences instructors. We have Mary Therese Galka, Marianne Jatzak, and Colette Schrank, and others represented in the room this afternoon. And I'd like to thank them for their enthusiastic cooperation and assistance with making this talk a reality. We have a very special guest in the audience I'd like to recognize at this point. A nice side note to our speaker, her dad, Professor Nelson Diebel, at one time taught history at Moraine, and I'd like you to stand up and be recognized. We're happy to have you here today. All of the above individuals helped us to be here today, but it's one person, our speaker, Catherine, who brought us here today. It is her story that causes us to come together and to appreciate her sense of caring. Her story begins with her education, and as an English instructor, I'm thrilled to tell you that her first degree is in literature, which she received from Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. She's currently finishing up a master's degree in International Intercultural Management from the School for International Training in Brattleboro, Vermont. And as a side note for me, if you're interested in that career, this is a premier institution for that type of training. She's doing a thesis on issues related to the accessing and providing of effective malaria treatment in malaria-endemic countries. Now, for those of you with siblings, and for those of you who wonder about what kind of influence those siblings have on your life, let me tell you a cute story about Catherine and her sibling Nelson and how he truly influenced her life. What he did is he invited her to Barcelona, Spain in 1992, where he just happened to be an Olympic winner, a medal winner, in swimming competition. And she tells me she wanted to see not only what the Olympics were about, but also to support her brother and to learn a little bit about the world, even though she herself doesn't swim, right? Not at all. He really did influence her life, because after that she came back to college. She did a semester abroad at Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia, and then upon graduation she went into the Peace Corps in Morocco, and she served there, and she established a women's literacy program, began a multi-language library, and assisted with vaccination efforts for nomadic children. She speaks both French and Moroccan Arabic. Kathy felt at that point that she really wanted to get into international medical aid, and she certainly did her homework. Listen to what she did, because you may want to do this someday. She decided that she'd look at different agencies, looking specifically at their mission statements. And when she found one that matched her own personal philosophy, she would sign on for that particular agency. Well, the one she found that matched hers was Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, you'll hear it called this afternoon, or we know the English equivalent, Doctors Without Borders. This was the agency for her. Her initial job with MSF had her in the capacity of a logistician/administrator for an HIV/AIDS assistance project in China. Most recently, she has been serving MSF in northern Sudan as a team leader/project coordinator, overseeing the daily operations, get ready for this, of a treatment center which included TFC, ICU, inpatient wards, outpatient, pharmacy, kitchen, and general food distribution services, but the list goes on. This position also required handling human resource matters and project planning while managing a staff of 140 nationals, 3 expats, a doctor, a nurse, and a logistician, in a very isolated, very basic setting, which you're about to see. But let's now have Kathy tell her own story, and then after her remarks, let's have your questions. Please join me in welcoming Catherine.
All right, can you guys hear me? Is that too loud? Sorry, I'm not used to having one of these things actually pinned onto me. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's great. I don't think I actually have to say much more about myself. I think she pretty much covered it. The only thing I have to admit is that I do not speak French. It would be very, very useful, but I don't. I speak a dialect of Arabic, and I can read French, because it's very often necessary. But yeah, if anybody speaks French at me, you'll get that really dumb, blank look that people get. No comprehension whatsoever. As she said, I'll be referring to it as MSF throughout my talk. That's what we call it. It's the acronym for Médecins Sans Frontières. The English translation is Doctors Without Borders. It's really only in the US that it's called Doctors Without Borders, so if you're looking for information on it and you look for Doctors Without Borders, it won't help you all that much. You'll find a lot more under MSF or Médecins Sans Frontières, either one of it. It's an organization that was started by 3 doctors. If you guys can throw back to your high school history classes, you remember learning about the Biafran War? We weren't actually involved in it, so you might not have heard too much about it. But it was a really nasty war in Africa in the 70s. And there were 3 doctors who were working for the Red Cross. We're in Biafra. The Red Cross has a policy of not talking about what they see when they come back. They do not get involved in the politics behind wars or in what they see on the field. What these people happened to see on the field was a lot of civilian casualties, a lot of targeting of civilians, and a lot of blocking access to medical care of the civilians in the field. And they were very frustrated when they came back, and they couldn't talk about what they had seen. And they started MSF in part to address that lack, the fact that there were all these things going on there that nobody had any idea were happening. So that's where MSF came from. It has grown a great deal now. We have projects in about 85 different countries right now. We have 5 different operational centers, France, Spain, Holland, Switzerland, and someplace else that I can't remember. Belgium, there we are. Got it in my data, answer that one. And Belgium. And then we also have about 22 different partner sections. The US does have one. It's based in New York. What I have for you guys to begin with, we will start out with a short videotape that kind of explains a little bit more about MSF, shows some things about the projects that we're doing, and then I have some slides from my most recent thing. So why don't we go ahead and do the video first. It's about 12 minutes, and then I'll come back up and talk at you for a bit more.
In a matter of seconds, the efforts of a lifetime and the lives of loved ones can be swept away. But if immediate relief reaches the scene of a disaster, thousands of people can be saved. Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, provides medical assistance to victims of natural disasters, armed conflict, refugee crises, and epidemics. It is often the first relief agency to arrive in a crisis, however remote, and the last to leave. Starvation remains one of the world's great killers. In Sudan, more than 1 million have faced famine caused by civil war and drought.
It's a crisis situation at the moment. People are starving to death, and every day you see death here. We're targeting the most vulnerable group, which are the under 5s.
Providing medical care, clean water and food, Doctors Without Borders makes the difference between death and life.
My job here is that I'm running this therapeutic feeding center, which is for the very most severely malnourished. So it's usually children under 5 that are most severely affected, and that's who we're feeding here.
Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, was founded in 1971 by a small group of French doctors. They believed that the world needed an organization that was able both to respond to medical emergencies and speak out on behalf of populations in danger. It has grown to become the world's largest private non-profit medical relief agency, with offices in 19 countries and relief programs in more than 85 countries worldwide. Volunteer doctors and nurses are on constant standby. Coming from all over the world, they offer their expertise from 6 months to several years. They are united by a commitment that transcends all boundaries to help people in need. Personifying that commitment is Dr. Jill Seaman. After 8 years working in Sudan, battling a rare tropical disease called Kala Azar, she has earned her warm welcome.
You need blankets, you need food, you need medicines, you need mosquito nets. And I'm just hoping that if I can continue to work, maybe we can get enough drugs in here, the local staff can keep enough people alive that, you know, 1 person out of every family lives. I mean, that's sort of what you have to focus on. And you think, you know, could we have done more? Always, always you're haunted by that, always.
Doctors Without Borders provides relief to people in need, regardless of race, religion, or political affiliation. To reach those in need, medical teams often venture to the world's most dangerous and remote corners. During the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s, donkey and horse caravans clandestinely crossed the Afghan border. Each caravan carried several tons of medical supplies under the constant threat of bombardment. Volunteers journeyed for over a month through deserts and snowy mountains to treat civilians trapped by war in the heart of Afghanistan. Whether by donkey or armored vehicle, Doctors Without Borders meets the constant challenge of delivering emergency medical care in war zones.
There seems to be fighting in Vedi.
Where?
There's a village down the road, a few miles.
Windows closed. Close the door.
Sure.
Helmets on.
Sure.
Okay, dobro.
I'm a surgeon from Sarajevo. There, as you can see now, we have 1 wounded man. He was wounded with shrapnels of granite, and we have to operate him immediately. As you can see in all these operations, here at the operation table, operation lamp, everything is a humanitarian aid. So without that help, we couldn't do anything.
In an overcrowded Siberian prison, Doctors Without Borders finds itself in the midst of another battle against tuberculosis. Treating the inmates is more than curing a disease. It is preventing the spread of infection when they return home. In addition, teams conduct studies on new, deadly strains of tuberculosis raging in the prison. A few pennies can buy protection from other infectious diseases. Measles, for example.
In this kind of precarious situation, a measles epidemic could be quite disastrous. So all the children between 6 months and 12 years are getting a measles vaccine. The infection rate is very high. They'll
How
be
many would you
catched.
expect to vaccinate today?
Today, over 1,000.
Refugees in the aftermath of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda crowded into camps in neighboring Zaire. The camps became a breeding ground for cholera. While the organization could not prevent the massive epidemic, by the 3rd week, its relief operation gained the upper hand. One by one, weak survivors were rehydrated and cared for. Death rates plummeted until the epidemic was under control. Strong logistics is a hallmark of Doctors Without Borders. In a crisis situation, pre-packaged emergency kits pioneered by the organization are a key tool. Stocking and managing these supplies is part of the behind-the-scenes work of logisticians, those who get the right equipment to the right spot at the right time. Doctors Without Borders often collaborates with other organizations to create an unbroken logistical chain. The task is completed only when medicines and food reach their final destination.
Good logistics can save as many lives in a lot of situations as doctors and nurses. We provide plastic sheeting, jerry cans to carry water. We drill wells, water treatment, all of our water and sanitation experts.
Among the many challenges that Doctors Without Borders faces, complacency and indifference are two of the greatest. Fighting injustice remains at the heart of the organization. Demanding free access to all civilians in need, the organization also reserves the right to speak out against the violence, killings, and deportations its teams witness.
A lot of what I feel that I'm doing is bearing witness, so that I can go home and really say what I've seen, say what's happening here.
Doctors and nurses did so during the horrors of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. In the Balkans in 1999, when masses of Kosovars were deported. In Sierra Leone, where mutilations have been used to spread terror among civilians. While media interest in humanitarian crises is fleeting, relief work has to be long-term. Mental health programs address the psychological scars of war. Teams run long-term relief programs directed at forgotten populations, from the indigenous peoples of the Amazon and Southeast Asia to those living in urban shantytowns. At dispensaries and clinics inside the slums, doctors and nurses treat diarrhea, skin infections, and other illnesses linked to poor sanitation. The HIV pandemic has triggered innovative campaigns aimed at high-risk groups. In Thailand, teams conduct home visits to people with AIDS. In Uganda, volunteers have united with traditional healers to reach the community. While in Cuba, they've taken to the streets, spreading information from person to person. To ensure that relief efforts remain sustainable even after the organization's departure, volunteers train local medical professionals and recruit construction workers to rehabilitate clinics. Thanks to its base of individual donors, millions of people worldwide, Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, is able to remain fiercely independent from political, religious, and economic powers. It combines its independence with financial prudence, making sure that at least 85% of all funds are spent on program activities. Together, the supporters of Doctors Without Borders and its field volunteers reach out and better the lives of millions of men, women, and children in more than 85 countries.
Besides helping people, you get plenty out of it as a doctor yourself. You find that instead of spending a large proportion of your resources on a few people, here it's really public health issues. You save a lot more lives in this environment than if you spend a lot of money on a few things. That's very encouraging as a doctor to see that you're making some difference.
These volunteers are not heroes. They're ordinary men and women who believe that their professional and moral responsibility extends beyond the boundaries of their own communities. To maintain its unique independence and freedom to assist all populations in danger, Doctors Without Borders relies mainly on your support.
As Linda said in her introduction, I have just recently returned from Sudan. I was not in the same project that Jill was in, but I was up in the north. I was working on a project. It's a treatment center that we were treating basically a disease called Kala Azar, or visceral leishmaniasis. It's a particularly nasty disease. It's transmitted through the bite of a sandfly. It's a parasite. Goes in, it's immunosuppressive. You get an enlarged spleen, you get a fever. In an area like we were in with a lot of malaria, you also get a lot of concurrent infections. We also saw a lot of malnutrition. Kala-azar is 95% fatal, 95 to 97% fatal if it's not treated. Treatment for it is very difficult, not only to get because there are very few drugs that can treat it, but also to get to where it needs to go because it does need to be handled correctly. It is an injection, and it is an injection every single day for at least 30 days. For an adult, you're talking around 10 or 20 cc's every single day of an injection for at least 30 days. After 30 days, we do a test of cure, and the test of cure, if it comes out negative, you're talking about another 30 days. After 30 days, we do another test of cure, still not gone, another 30 days. In the meantime, if during any of that time, you have to stop and get treated for another disease along the way, such as malaria, you have to stop the SSG treatment and then start it all over again when you're done being treated for malaria. So if you have a patient who has done 20 days of their SSG treatment and they get malaria and you have to take them off the SSG in order to treat with quinine, or quinine as we call it here, then you have to start all over again on day 1 for your Kala-azar treatment. It is spread by a very, very, very small, little tiny, you don't even feel the bite, and you usually don't even see it. We did distribute bed nets to everybody in our hospital. We were dealing with an epidemic of Kala-azar where we were. We have no idea why. Very little is known about the disease, why it goes into endemic levels or epidemic levels. There's really not much known about it. We were in the middle of nowhere. Just before I got there, we were actually planning on closing the treatment center. We had been at endemic levels for about 3 years, and then all of a sudden it jumped up. They went from having 80 patients to, when I was there, around 700 patients. I'll show you slides of our treatment center. When I say it was basic and it was rural, we're talking no running water. We had 2 wells. We had no electricity except for our generator, which was run from 2 o'clock until 4 o'clock in the afternoon to help out our lab, to help them do their diagnoses. And it went from 6:30 to 11 o'clock at night. So we could have fans sometimes. Temperatures were usually around 100 to 115 degrees during the dry season. During the wet season, it dropped down into the 90s to 100s, but was very, very wet. It was a very interesting experience. I've got some pictures of us trying to get tractors and trucks and all sorts out of the mud that we got trapped in. As you can imagine, when you're talking about a flood situation, Kala-azar epidemic, you have people coming from literally walking for weeks from all corners of Sudan to get to our treatment center, because we're one of the few places that could treat it. You're talking about a lot of malaria as well. So we did actually have a mini malaria epidemic in the middle of our larger Kala-azar epidemic. There's also a lot of food insecurity in Sudan. You guys heard there's been a war going on there for about 40 years. It's a really, really nasty civil war. It's been going on in various different forms and between various different groups since the British pulled out after they ended their colonization of Sudan. We just recently have signed a peace deal, sort of, and there is hope that it will be getting better, but at the moment it is basically a destroyed society. There is just nothing there. In Khartoum you can get some things, but in general there's just really not much. And not only does that include food, it also includes medicine, access to medicine. Problems also with treating something like malaria. You're talking about the cost of the drugs as well. For MSF, it's not so much an issue. For a government like Sudan, it is a huge issue. They don't have any money. So how do you get treatment to people who need treatment, who are very inaccessible, when you can't even afford to buy the drugs? The drug that they can afford, chloroquine, is 85% resistant. The malaria bug is basically 85% resistant to the drug, and yet it's still the first treatment option officially in Sudan to deal with malaria because it's what they can afford. They cannot afford the other treatments. If you move on to the next treatment that works, then you're talking about quinine, which has to be given injectable, and like I said, not only is it very bad for the person, but it has a lot of counter effects with other drugs for other treatments and other diseases. We only treated Kala-Azar and emergency situations in our place. When we could, we would take one of our ambulances and take them to the nearest hospital, which during the dry season was about 5.5 hours away from us in Gadada City. And in the rainy season, we couldn't transfer anybody. We couldn't transfer ourselves, actually, for about 5 weeks. We couldn't get anything in or out. These are all the sort of things that you have to learn to deal with. But though there are a lot of challenges, and for me personally, as a non-medical person, it was very, very frustrating because I couldn't do anything hands-on. And I could see this, and I could know what was going on, and I could do everything in my power to support the people who were medical. But in the end, they faced a great deal of pressure, also a great deal of rewards. We had a 95% cure rate for Kala-Azar, which is amazing for a disease like Kala-Azar. And like I said, we ran a therapeutic feeding center. Therapeutic feeding center is for people whose weight for height is below 80%, sorry, 60%. And then we also run a supplementary feeding center for people who were a bit more. To put this in something you guys might be able to picture, we had a 3-year-old who weighed 6.5 pounds. She was a bit extreme. She was in our therapeutic feeding center, but that's what we were looking at. When you're talking about that much malnutrition, then it also becomes much harder to treat people. But when you see somebody like that, she was with us for about 2 months, and at the end she walked out with her family. Well, most of her family. So there are huge, huge rewards to being able to see what you've accomplished, as well as a lot of challenges. You learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about what's going on in the world that you don't normally think about or don't normally see. And a lot of rewards. I've got some slides from my time there. I'll kind of talk you through them as we go. And then after we go through that, I'll probably take us back to my time in China as well, which wasn't quite as dramatic. It was a little more normal. And then you guys can ask any questions that you may have. Let's see if I can work this thing. Okay, I don't know if you guys can see that very well. We need to turn down the lights a little bit more. This is our therapeutic feeding center distribution. So all of these things that you see back here, these are all huge sacks of wheat. They weighed about 30 pounds each. We handed out wheat, oil, salt, and lentils, or beans, depending on what we could get there. We did occasionally have some transport problems. We got most of our food from UNICEF or World Food Fund, the World Food Program, depended on who could get there when and what their stocks were. Like I said, there's a food insecurity issue in Sudan, so sometimes we were scrambling a bit. This is where these are all our patients who are waiting to get their injection. Like I said, they would get injected every single day. We put up woven mats to shade them. Like I said, it was very, very, very hot, so we needed to have shaded areas. Where we happened to be, we could not expand. There was a river on one side, a marsh on the other, and a town on the other side. So we were very, very limited as to space. So trying to come up with places where even we could get people out of the sun while they were waiting for treatment was difficult. Everybody who went in had their treatment card. They would see the nurse who would assess them, and then they would go in for their injection if there was nothing wrong with them. If they were sick, had lost weight, things like that, then they would get sent back to our doctors. We only had 2 doctors, one who was a national staff doctor, one who was an expatriate foreigner. And they were treating everybody in the ICU, in the TFC, in the everything. So we're talking up to 700 patients at any one time. We did have about 35 national staff nurses and 1 expatriate nurse as well. This is Khadija. She was one of our patients. She had been with us for 3 months, and as she was about to go home, her baby, you can see just underneath there, tested positive for Kala-Azar. So they stayed with us for another 2 months. This is our well, which was sort of the center of our compound. This is our hospital compound that you're looking at. This is during the rainy season, obviously. The thatched roof structure over to the right with these cement walls. That was one of our cooking areas. We had to be very, very careful, especially during the dry season, but also during the rainy season, because it was very confined spaces. Most of the local materials that were used were thatch or other sorts of woven mat type things. Very, very, very flammable. Most of the cooking was done on open fires, so we were constantly worried about what would happen if the fire went out. Over here you can just see the very corner of it, and then you can see one there in the back. That is actually our patient compounds. That is where our patients stayed, who were not in our TFC, who were not in our ICU, or who were not in the supplementary feeding program. We would have family members come in with the patients because they would be the ones who were feeding them, they would be the ones who were changing them, they would be the ones who were doing basically everything except for actually administering the drugs. So we did have some patients who came in without family. We did have a special ward for them, and we had people who were assigned just to take care of those people. In general, we had families there. So when we say 700 patients were living there, you figure at least 1 or 2 co-patients per patient. We had a huge number of people in a very, very small area. This is a family who was with us for about 3 months. The whole family, every single one of those women came in. They had walked for about 4 days to get to us. They had heard that we were up there. They walked for 4 days to get there. They all had Kal-Azar except for Husseina, who was the little baby. Every single one of the women actually recovered and did go home, which was fantastic. They were with us for, well, anywhere between 2 and, no, right, she went home after 1 month. The rest of them were there for 2, and then we had one who was there for 3 months. And little Husseina became kind of our mascot because all of her family was sick. All these women were deathly ill. They were all taking care of each other. They had nobody else. The men couldn't leave because they were harvesting the fields. And if you stop harvesting the fields, you have no money. If you have no money, you have no food. If you have no food, you're going to lower your resistance. Chances are you're going to get Kal-Azar again the next year. It's this big cycle. So at some point you have to decide, okay, somebody's going to have to stay and at least try to get us some money so that chances are somebody won't get it next year. It can be a very difficult cycle. This is an indoor shot of our patient living compound. This is where our patients lived. The green things are mosquito nets. They're a particular type of mosquito net, very, very fine mesh because the Kal-Azar sandfly is very, very small, so they're finer net than a regular mosquito net is. They're also impregnated with an anti-insecticide. And they don't smell very good, and they're very, very, very hot. We had a very difficult time getting people to sleep underneath them. You're talking 100 degrees, 115 degrees, and you're asking somebody to cover themselves with something that cuts out almost all air. So it was very difficult to just get used to have to do cycles through at about, we used to do one at about 11:30 and one at about 2:30 in the morning. We had somebody who was assigned to do it and to pull down bed nets over our patients, because not only then did it run the chance of having our patients get sick with something else, but if we had anybody there who was healthy, who wasn't under a bed net, their chances of getting Kal-Azar or malaria went up dramatically if they weren't underneath the bed nets. But it's very difficult to tell somebody when it's 110 degrees that they need to put something over them. This is our ICU. This is where we treated our severely ill patients. We had 22 beds, if we really, really crammed them. We did have solar lamps in there, so at night, when our nurses and our doctor, if he got called in at night, had to do injections, they could see enough to maybe perhaps be able to do it. We also had solar flashlights, only for the ICU. We ran our own pharmacy, which is just behind the ICU, and our own lab, which was just the other side. We could do blood transfusions, but we did have difficulty in getting blood that, first of all, would match, second of all, that people would be willing to donate. There's a lot of cultural taboos against donating blood or giving blood or accepting blood. We could only test for HIV and malaria and a couple of other things. So generally we tried to get it from a direct relative. We did not have majorly sophisticated screening processes. We kind of got the basics, and we were pretty frugal about when we did our transfers, because it's also very hard to store and keep all the blood bags that you need in order to do blood transfusions. Those were kept in our pharmacy, which was sort of cool. We had jury-rigged an air situation there, so it was pretty much the coolest place on our compound. We have to be very careful with temperature of a lot of our drugs. And we do have a cold chain. We had a refrigerator for our vaccines and for anything that needed to stay at a constant temperature, and that was also run off of our solar batteries, which were charged from our generator, which ran those few hours a day. This is another shot of our ICU. The green top tables there, the plastic covering over it, that's where our nurses gave the injections. So they just had a basic table, lay out all the stuff, kind of wait. This is our lab. Thomas, who's over there on the right, he was in charge of our lab. He's absolutely amazing. He could do incredible things with nothing. The only time I've ever seen him freak out is when we ran out of saline, and you can't do any of the tests that you need for pretty much anything. You can't do any blood transfusions, and you can't test for Kala-Azar without the saline. We ended up bringing in a helicopter because we couldn't get in any other forms of transport. This is Yusuf. He was our clinic supervisor. He ran our hospital in conjunction with our expat nurse and our expat doctor. When both our expat doctor and our expat nurse left, Yusuf ran everything. He was absolutely incredible. The ward over there to his left, we had our tuberculosis patients in because they, of course, have to be separated out. We did run a modified sort of DOTS program in treating our tuberculosis. DOTS stands for a directly observed treatment system, and it's a daily pill. You have to watch them while they take the pills, and it goes on for 3 to 6 months, depending on which protocols you're using. Also complicated with Kala-Azar and with malaria, and the fact that we didn't have very much room. Tuberculosis was a bit of a problem, but we were very lucky. We never actually had more than 2 or 3 tuberculosis patients at any one time, so we were pretty lucky. Over there, here on his right, is our therapeutic feeding center area. Oh, no, here we are. These are all little girls who worked just outside of our compound. They didn't go to school, obviously. They were there every single day selling food, little sweets, sometimes some vegetables. Like I said, we had 700 patients. We were a huge force in the community. Lots of people coming in and spending lots of money. The village, when we opened up 7 years ago, only had about 400 people in it. When I was there, we had about 1,000 people, 1,000 to 2,000 people in the village. So as more patients came in, obviously you need to buy more things. You get more traders moving in. As the traders move in, they set up some stores, some different things, and then they are there as well. We ended up treating a lot of the local populace as well. This is, again, Husseina and her mother in their 2nd month there. I think they transferred, so it's the day they're transferring out of the ICU and into the regular wards. So it was a big day. This was all of the people on my staff who basically ran things with me. We had a meeting every single week in which we discussed everything that was going on in the area, security concerns. Our logistics people talked about supply concerns. Medical people were concerned about what we were going to do with our outpatient department because we were getting in a lot of things that we weren't actually allowed to treat. We also had somebody who was on, the guy in the back with the hat on. He was not only he ran our kitchen and our food stocks, but he was also a member of the local council. So when things were going on with the local council or with the military, with the police, he was also our liaison with them. And we had meetings with the police and I had meetings with the military and the police about once a month. Whether that was getting staff out of jail, whether that was asking the military not to shoot down our helicopter when it came, all that sort of thing. We covered not only in regular contact with them, but also in our monthly meetings. And then Yusuf and Idris were our main contacts with them. When I said it rained, this was after about 5 weeks of us being completely flooded in with no transport possible at the very, very end of my time. Actually, I didn't know if I was going to be able to get home. We decided that I would be the guinea pig cargo to see if we could get out to Gadada. We went with 2 tractors, and I was in this truck that you can just see. It's called a Unimog. It's well, we used to have Land Cruisers, but they stopped being able to get through in about June or July. They can no longer move anywhere. We just parked them, gave up on them. Moved into the Unimog, which has bigger tires and is more powerful. When the Unimog can't get through, you switch to the tractors. When the tractors can't get through, you give up. We went with the Unimog and 2 tractors. It took us 3 days to get to Gaddaf. Spent a lot of time in the Unimog. And we actually managed to shear off the axle of one of the tractors in getting ourselves there. So the weather for us at the end was quite a big deal. This is an oil truck who was happening to be crossing an area when the road collapsed underneath it. So everybody was fine. We had just come up. We were trying to get back to Gaddaf, and we ran across this. We ended up having to go about a half a day in one direction, cross at another place, and come back in order to get across. I don't know if they ever got out. There were a whole bunch of us trying. Eventually, I think they probably just piled into somebody else's car and decided to wait until the ground firmed up a bit. And there's Husseina again. We ended up sort of taking Husseina out a lot because her whole family was sick. And when you're sick, what you want to do is sleep, and it's very hard to sleep with a 2-year-old. So we would do morning rounds, and we would pick her up, and we would take her off. This is my office. This is sort of all of our office. And she spent the days with us for several months. She became our little mascot, kind of wandered around with us. And we cried a lot when she went home. She is actually of a tribe called, you can see the little beading that they have, it's the Falata tribe. You noticed how the mother was dressed. There's a lot of nomadic tribes where I was, and very, very colorful dress, very, very different sort of culture from the rest of Sudan. I think that's about it. My slides there. It all sounds very dramatic. You see the slides and you hear what happened in Sudan. It was very stressful. It was wonderful. I would do it again in a heartbeat. I'm actually probably leaving in a few weeks-ish, we think. Not to go back to Sudan, but to go somewhere else. But we run a lot of different programs, so it's not all like this. You do have some that are very, very comfortable. Just before this, I was in Sichuan province in China, which is where the best Chinese food comes from, not that I'm biased. It's the really spicy Chinese food. Never eaten better in my life. It's fantastic. And it's down in the southwestern part, kind of up where Thailand and Burma come up a little bit north of that. And we were running an HIV and AIDS education project among a minority group. The area where I was living was right on the main drug route from Burma over to Hong Kong and Beijing. We were working with a minority group that speaks literally an entirely different language. Mostly don't speak Chinese. The Red Army actually only got into this area in 1965. They're very, very independent. They're also very, very, very poor. China has an almost completely collapsed healthcare system. Very little there. And when I was there, they were insisting that there was no AIDS in China. This was in 2001. And the level of knowledge about HIV and AIDS when I was there was at levels that you would imagine were here in about 1984. They don't know what the disease is. They don't know how you get it. They think you can just take a pill and get it cured. They have no idea at all. Officially, the Chinese government said that anybody who has AIDS is either a drug user or has had contact with foreigners. So trying to run an education campaign when the entire government, and in China, they're pretty powerful, is saying something completely different to them was very, very difficult. We actually, at the end of my time there, did decide that we could not work within that structure and that setting, and we did pull out of that particular project. We run other projects in China, but this one was very, very frustrating. To give you an idea, we had World AIDS Day, ran all these big campaigns, did all this stuff, and at the end we went into one of the brothels, karaoke bars, and there were 4 men in full uniform from the Public Security Bureau with 3 girls on their laps on World AIDS Day, after they had just come from our big rally and done all this sort of thing. So it was very, very hard to get the message across to people that there was a problem to begin with, and second of all, what a big problem it was. As far as they were concerned, it's a foreigner disease or a bad person disease. So you either deserve to get it or you're a foreigner. They had a big thing on AIDS on the television just before I left, and it showed all the statistics for AIDS in Africa, with no mention at all that it was in China, even remotely. And they're changing a little bit. Now I think they're admitting to maybe 1 million cases of AIDS in China. I think that was the last one I heard. But I can tell you there were at least 1 million cases just from looking in our province. So very, very frustrating, but an incredible place to be and an incredible place to work. Like once again, our staff was just incredible. I've never ever worked anywhere where I haven't been amazed at our national staff, who keep things going when we're not there, and sort of the backbone of everything. We couldn't do it without them. And then I also, after China came back, worked on a campaign to raise awareness of the fact that there's so much difficulty getting treatment for people in the developing world, treatment for tropical diseases, various different things. If you actually go to our website, there's an awful lot. It's called the Access to Essential Medicines campaign and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative. Both of those are things that MSF is doing to raise awareness of the problems for most of the world's population in receiving life-saving essential medicine. I think it's about time for me to stop here. So if you guys have any questions.
I have one. Do you think the Sudanese have enough intelligence or work ethic? Should, let's say, Nike were to put a shoe factory there to allow them to earn some money?
I think you've pretty much just jumped from kindergarten to college. First of all, yes, no question that the Sudanese have a work ethic. We were putting in 12, 14-hour days, as were our staff. And we got to leave. I left after 9 months. I came home and slept for a month. They stayed for years and years. And they work unbelievably hard and generally better than we do. They were just amazing. The problem in Sudan, there's so many levels to it. They've had war for so long to begin with. You're talking about at least 2 million people who have been displaced and around 1.5 million who have died. The numbers vary depending on where you're looking at them. They're impossible to confirm. Some people say 5 million are displaced and 2 million have died. It's been going on for a really long time. It targets civilians. It uses food aid and food insecurity to create famines, to move people. It's tribal. If you hear about it, you often hear that it's the Muslim government in the north against the Christian south. That's way too simplistic. There's also a lot of tribal issues going on. All of the opposition groups are also splitting apart, fighting among themselves, making alliances and not making alliances. And a lot of it is targeted at civilians. On top of that, when you have a situation in which so many people have been displaced and they want to go home, but they cannot go home because it's too dangerous, you're creating another economic problem. And then you have people who have grown up who have never seen home, but they think of it as home because that's where home is. Because home to them is not in the north. It's in the south, but they can't go there, but they've never seen it. And maybe the last person who's ever been there is their grandparents. If you have a life expectancy of 40 years and you've been at war for 40 years, well, there's an entire generation or two who literally have no idea what peace is. No clue. They've seen it on TV. So first you have to learn, you have to figure out who you are. You've grown up in the north, your family's grown up in the north, you've been refugees, you have no money. You don't even necessarily speak the same language as all the people you've grown up around. You have to go back home. You have to find out who's died. You have to find out what do you do to survive in the place where you go home. You have to figure out how to do all the things that you've been doing your whole life, say in Khartoum. And you have to get to know what you've lost. I mean, there are people who haven't seen their brothers for 20, 30 years. People who haven't seen their kids since they were 2. I mean, to talk about a Nike factory, yes, if Nike goes in there and builds, that'd be great, and people would have jobs, and that would be wonderful, but there's so many more basic things that have to go on there as well. It's not as simple as just chucking money at it. There's a lot of other issues that go on into it.
My concern is also with the volunteers, about their safety, because if they're not safe in going there, there's nothing to do.
Yeah, we've been working in a lot of war zones for most of our time. We're very, very conscious of security. If you saw on the video, they have the radio. We stay in contact. You do twice daily radio checks in a normal sort of situation, and that's to the capital. In situations that might get a bit nervous, you up it a bit. When we invaded Iraq, I was in Sudan with a British doctor and an Australian nurse and me. So we were a bit concerned for a few weeks as to whether that would be an issue. It of course was not. But during that time you up your security. It's a matter of being aware of what's going on around you. You can leave at any time if you don't feel you're safe. There's no repercussions. If I were to say, I'm not comfortable here, I need to leave, I would have gotten in a car and left. And any volunteer has that right at any time. We also do sometimes pull people out who don't want to be pulled out. Often you'll get a field team that says, no, it's not so bad, and you'll have a capital that's saying, yes, it is. And if it comes down to that, you always go with the safest option, which is to pull people out. That's not to say that nothing has ever happened. We do have a head of mission, a guy who is basically running all the projects in Chechnya, which is, of course, a very, very, very extreme example. He's actually was kidnapped, we don't know by who, and he's been held for 14 months. So it does happen, not as often as it sounds like or it might seem like. I think they've only had 4 kidnaps in their history. I could be wrong about that. And most of the injuries or whatever comes from car accidents is usually the big thing. But very, very, very security where you have to be. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do. And often we'll pull out, wait a bit, someplace safer, go back in.
Was there a problem with members of the staff getting the diseases?
We did, actually. We had, I think, about 4 members of our staff had Kala Azar. We had 2 different types. We all lived on the hospital, almost all of us, or in the village. And those who were living in the village were at higher risk for getting them. Those of us who were living on the hospital, we kind of policed each other to make sure we were all using our bed nets and that it didn't come untucked during the night. So we did have that, whereas a lot of the people who were living in the village might not necessarily have that. We had 4 people who came down with Kala Azar, all who were treated and done within a month. And for any of our staff who got it, they obviously got free treatment because we give free treatment to everybody. But then they were paid the whole time they were sick, and then they also had a month of recovery time because Kala Azar is such a nasty disease. It takes a month to get your energy back. So we get them a month of treatment, or however long the treatment took, 2 months, 3 months, whatever, plus another month off with pay until they felt better. Malaria was actually a much bigger problem. I would say about 40% of us got malaria, including me. So, you know, but malaria is very, very difficult to avoid as well because the mosquitoes are out and about, and when you're in a flood, it's there. But we do have treatment, which is nice.
Somebody would like to get involved in your project organization. Do you go to your website, or do you contact somebody locally?
Yeah, no, we've got, the website is on pretty much all of our flyers. It's www.doctorswithoutborders.org, or you can go to www.msf.org, and that should do it. Our New York office is it's in New York on 37th Street, I believe. But if you go through our website, it's got all the phone numbers, and I believe you can even apply online now. 85% of our donations actually come from individuals, small personal donations. We try to keep it that way. We don't like to fall below 82% because if we get small personal donations, it allows us to maintain our individuality, our neutrality. It allows us to say, hey, these people need help, we're going in. Whether or not the US government or the French government or the government of that country wants us to, this is a population of danger, and we're going to treat them. And we have the independence to do that, rather than to have to worry about our funding being pulled if we piss off a government or a corporation or a foundation.
What's the definition of small amounts?
Well, it's everything from, you know, $5 to people who give, you know, lots and lots. But yeah, we take everything. I have no idea if there's a maximum. I've never had that question.
Because you say small amounts, and I am wondering whether it's a 1,000 or 500,000.
I have no idea. Yeah, I don't know. You would definitely have to ask the New York office about that. But like, wow, a maximum. I've never had that one before.
I just want to know how you spell Kala Azar.
K-A-L-A, and then a second word, A-Z-A-R. And its technical term is visceral leishmaniasis. But if you look up Kala Azar, you'll be able to find stuff about it.
One quick question. Give us a quick definition of where this is at, north, south, east, west Africa.
Sudan, it's in East Africa. It's just below Egypt, and it's where I was right next to Ethiopia and Eritrea. Goes all the way down, borders Chad, borders Uganda. It's huge. It's a really, really big country. So it's actually, I believe, the biggest country in Africa.
This lady's question about donations is a perfect segue to what I'm about to say. In her generosity, Kathy has declined any kind of speaking engagement fee today, preferring instead that the fee go to MSF. So I think that's very kind of her, but we do have a small token of our appreciation. You have a lot of papers in your life, but here's something to keep them down.
Oh, hey.
In place. So please thank Kathy with me for coming today.